Good morning, everybody. We'll start in just a minute, but I'm glad you're here. If you don't want to take part in the class, that's okay. You can just sit and eat your breakfast. You do not have to take part. I know that because we've got an extra class right now, there are fewer places to sit and enjoy a quiet breakfast, but y'all can just keep right on going. But I'm glad that you're here, all of you. Hey, friends, how are y'all? Good to see you. Welcome. I'm about to get a new microphone. Hello. Hello. How are y'all? Good to see you. Thank you. Let me give you another one of those. There you go. There you go. You're welcome. It's in the conference room, which is... You're welcome. Everybody, I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome. We're continuing our series on feast or famine. We're actually really focusing on famine, but famine is not nearly as interesting a word, perhaps, or as inviting a word as feast. So I've given it a dual name, but we're talking about famine from the Bible, but we're talking in particular about the theological significance of famine and what the theological significance of biblical famines might tell us about the theological significance of modern day famines. Let me change out my microphone so I can get one with a pop screen so you don't hear my H's and P's. Give me just a second. That should be better. All right. So let's start with a prayer. If you are watching online, you can probably see this prayer at the top of the screen. If you're in the room with us, you can either read it from the top of the screen or the top of the handout. And if you didn't get a handout, there are extra ones by the coffee pot. But let's start by praying this prayer out loud together. Let us pray. O gracious God, you open your hand and fill all things living with plenteousness. Bless the lands and waters and multiply the harvests of the world. Let your Spirit go forth that it may renew the face of the earth. Show your loving kindness that our land may give its increase, and save us from selfish use of what you give us, that all people everywhere may give you thanks. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Again, welcome. It's a 3-week series, and it's not an accident that we're studying famine and food insecurity right now. This is the second in a 3-week series. Last week, we talked about sort of famine and revelation. Famine, not the book of Revelation, famine and revelation, and repentance, sort of a language about how the prophet Elijah, in his wrestling with King Ahab, kept making connections that the reason this famine has come upon God's people is to point out the failures of our leaders, in that case, King Ahab. And so we read several snapshots from 1 Kings, and the vivid descriptions of the drought and the famine were just powerful. But my favorite parts are the part when God shows up in a profound way. I think we take it for granted how significant the relationship is between political leadership and the availability of food. I don't think the people in Ukraine are taking that for granted today. But there's a relationship between the political operations and the availability of food, and that's directly because of food supply and the use of land. It's also related to the way that goods are redistributed, whether it's taxes or other means. But it's also about longer-term things like climate, like weather, like water, like the use of land. And so the inavailability of food in the first King's story reminds us that when our political leaders are failing to live up to their obligation to help all their people be cared for, people experience famine. That is not to say that God punishes us when we have bad leaders by giving us famine, but we might make the connection, the theological connection, by asking, where is God in the midst of this hardship? Upon whom does that hardship fall? And what's God's will as we sort our way through it? So that was last week. This week, we are shifting slightly, staying in the Old Testament, but shifting from kind of a political landscape, although politics will still be a role, to a clarifying famine is the theme for this week. And what I want us to focus on this week is what's the purpose of this famine? And as the story unfolds, I think we'll see several purposes, but also a clarifying purpose. And I wonder if part of what we're called to do in a world where food is abundant and yet not always available, to ask, what is this supposed to teach us? And then next week, we're going to look at a New Testament story, the story of the prodigal son. And there's a famine that plays a role in that story. And we'll talk about personal famine. So today, we're going to look at this story. I've got a staple on your handout, which means we got a lot of text to go through. But I've trimmed. You'll see lots of ellipses where I've sort of cut off bits of the text. And it's not fair to do that. It is not fair to skip important, valuable parts of the story. But if I gave us all of Genesis 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, and 47, which is what we'd need to read to hear the whole story, we'd have to give up on the 11 o'clock service and maybe even then some. So if you want to know more, just open your Bible. Open your Bible to Genesis 41 or go back even further to the start of the story of Joseph and his brothers. Has anybody ever seen the musical Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat? Yeah, right? Some of us have, right? This is the story, or at least a snapshot of it. It's a great story. The Bible is full of great stories that teach us something even today. So let's read this first section, which goes on just the top of the second page. Sections from the first part of Genesis 41. Who would read that for us, please? And Adeline will come bring you a microphone so that not only we can hear you, but so that the people at home can hear you as well. Who would read for us the first bit from Genesis 41 over to the top of the second page? Who might read that? Thank you so much.
Genesis 41:1. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and there came up out of the Nile 7 sleek and fat cows, and they grazed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and thin cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows, and Pharaoh awoke. Then he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. Then 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Pharaoh awoke, and it was a dream. In the morning his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who would interpret them to Pharaoh. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. Their dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, as are the 7 empty ears, blighted by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. After them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land. The plenty will no longer be known in the land because of the famine that will follow, for it will be very grievous. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and lay up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. The food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. All right, what do you notice? Does this story seem familiar? Are we starting to? Yeah, that's right. I remember this bit. Joseph and the dreamer, right? Dreams have been important. We've skipped some other exciting episodes about Joseph and dreams. But as this sort of jogs your memory again, you're like, oh yeah, I remember that part of the musical. What catches your attention? What do you notice in this first part of the reading? What do you notice? Yeah, Ray.
Well, I thought his interpretation was very elegant. The dreams are one and the same.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. That's an insight. That's a key insight, right? Not just the content, but the nature of the revelation. Yeah. What else did you notice? What else was interesting to you? No, what else was interesting to you? Yeah, Ray?
I'm not sure how the math works out. 1/5 times 7 is 7/5. Why didn't he take half the produce for the 7 years to cover the other 7?
Good question. Although, if he's only taking 20% each year, and he's got to cover 7 years, I guess what he's saying is things are going to be tight, but maybe not devastating, right? If you set aside 20% to cover 100% of your expenses, you're going to have a shortfall, but it could be worse, maybe, yeah? But there's some math. I do want to note there's some math involved. There's some very clear math involved. Not only 7 years, but a fifth, 20%. And I don't know how much you save, but hats off to the people who save 20%, right? That's a significant bit of savings. We typically invite people to give 10% to the church. That requires some planning. If you're going to let go of 10% of your income, you've got to plan. So Joseph is saying you're going to have to go without 20% and do it. 20% and do without it for 7 years before it becomes due. That's an odd kind of operation. And I suppose there are some other clever bits because grain might not keep that long, and so maybe we're replacing that grain and use it. But anyway, there's some economy going on. Who gave Pharaoh the dream? God. The text seems to suggest that God did. I think. It's God's. Joseph says to Pharaoh, God is revealing to you what God is about to do. And so I think the implication is that. But I wonder, is God revealing it in the dream, or is God revealing it in the interpretation of the dream? I just wonder how dreams work. I just think dreams are fascinating. We have a dream group at St. Paul's that meets once a month to do some contemplative work on dreams. That's not supposed to be an advertisement for that, but it's an interesting group that meets on a Sunday afternoon once a month to kind of just imagine how is God at work in and through our dreams. I find that a fascinating subject. So if you had to nail it, if you had to define it now, I know there's more to read, and if you remember the rest of the story, kind of ignore that for just a moment. Given only what we've read so far, if you had to say, what's the point of this famine? What would you say it is? What's the point of the famine? Yeah, Ray?
To give Pharaoh the opportunity to put someone wise and discerning over the food management.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and not only someone wise, but also Joseph, right? So there's, I would say at least two opportunities. One is to protect Egypt, right? To anticipate a famine, right? This is helpful. The famine is there to kind of show the skill and the planning and the operations of Egypt, of Pharaoh. But if you read up to this point, we've known this character Joseph, who has used dreams to get him in trouble and dreams to get him out of trouble. And it feels like this famine at this point of the story is really just to give Joseph access to Pharaoh and to governance, which may or may not be the case. Anybody else have an insight into what would you say is the purpose of the famine? It's not all the way clear. So let's just hold off on that. Let's keep reading. Let's keep reading. All right, we've got another section from Genesis 41, picking up right where we left off. Who would read this bit for us, please? The rest of that page. Who would read that? Thank you, Nancy.
The proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find anyone else like this, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand. He arrayed him in the garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride on the chariot of his second in command, and they cried out in front of him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plenteous years, the earth produced abundantly. He gathered up all the food of the 7 years, when there was plenty in the land of Egypt, and stored up food in the cities. He stored up in every city the food from the fields around it. So Joseph stored up grain in such abundance, like the sand of the sea, that he stopped measuring it. It was beyond measure. The 7 years of plenty that prevailed in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come. Just as Joseph had said, there was famine in every country, but throughout the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." And since the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the world came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine became severe throughout the world.
Thank you. What do you notice? What do you notice, Ray?
It solved my math problem. It looks like there was a superabundance of grain for this time.
A superabundance. Yeah, superabundance. Which there's something to be said about that, right? I mean, it's a story. It's a story that's preserved not only to keep a record of history, but to teach us something. And there's something about how we approach abundance or superabundance and how we approach lean times. Absolutely. What else do you notice? Yeah.
There was a very probably sophisticated method for accounting. They knew how much grain they were gathering and putting away. Until it got to be so much, they lost count and couldn't keep up with it. So it kind of overwhelmed their ability to do that. I thought that was interesting. And also, just how easily Pharaoh, on the basis of interpreting a dream, gave all this power and authority to Joseph. I mean, that's kind of astounding.
Yes, and I think we're supposed to be astounded by that. I wonder what made that happen. Like, I mean, to take off your signet ring is to take off the seal of your authority and to trust somebody with it, which means Joseph could sort of write an edict and then seal it with the signet ring, and everybody would know that Pharaoh had commanded it, even without checking. So to hand somebody your signet ring is like to hand somebody, I don't know, your sheet of all your passwords, right? If you keep a sheet of all your passwords, because, you know, we all have 20 of them. But anyway, so if you hand, what does it mean to hand somebody that? It's a significant thing. And Joseph, like this strange person who sort of made his way up in life, but was a prisoner, had been accused of sexual assault, falsely accused, we are told, but still amazing that he came to this place. Yeah. What else? What else is of note to you? Think about that first question that I put on the page. At this point, what's Pharaoh's relationship with Joseph's God? Like, there's some strange language at the beginning about when Pharaoh is sort of talking about Joseph, but also talking about God. If you are the journalist who sort of watched this and you were asked to describe Pharaoh's relationship with God, what would you say it is? Richard, what would you say it is?
Well, at this time, Canaan, or Canaan, if you use the Hebrew, was actually a region of Egypt. They owned it. And so he would have been very familiar with the Canaanite gods. And I forgot if they had already adopted, Israel's family had already adopted the worship of Yahweh, but other than that, they would have been into, Elohim and Asherah and all the Canaanite gods. So Pharaoh would have been very familiar with them since he possessed that land.
Thank you. I'm curious, what does the text suggest to us about the relationship between Pharaoh and God? That's right. What does the text suggest? What does it mean? What does it mean when Pharaoh says, can we find anyone else like this, one in whom is the Spirit of God, since God has shown you all this? What's the significance of that? Is Pharaoh converted? Does anybody think Pharaoh is now a faithful Israelite? I don't think so. That doesn't seem right. But at least there's some kind of acknowledgement going on, right? Just sort of tease that out a little bit. Sort of sit with that paragraph. I think, something about recognizing God's origin, where God is. Yeah, thank you. Recognizing God's authority. Thank you. Absolutely. So even if Pharaoh doesn't worship this God as the only true God, at least he recognizes there's some good juju going on here, right? Right? There's something good. There's some power here, and I want that power, right? And I think part of that power comes from the recognition of that power. Part of the recognition comes from what we read in the previous section, which is nobody in all the land was able to interpret this dream. And then Joseph gives a clear interpretation. And it's an interpretation that Pharaoh gets, like he gets intuitively. He thinks, oh, I got to pay attention to that, enough to where he would give him the power. So Pharaoh sees in Joseph not only a clever leader, someone with a clear plan, but also someone who's in touch with spirit, with God's Spirit. Yeah, I think the story, which is not an Egyptian story, but an Israelite story, I think the story is supposed to help us sort of lead us through that strange place where we're not exactly sure what Pharaoh believes, but we're at least able to see that God is present in a way that's gotten Pharaoh's attention, and that God is somehow communicating to Pharaoh through his dream. So I do think that's a tender spot. Ray?
In verse 39, since God has shown you all this, I can't remember if this is the Yahweh strain or the Elohim strain, but
it's not the Yahwist, it's the Elohim. Yeah,
so
yeah.
It's a quote, so maybe Pharaoh said the word Elohim instead of using one of the 20 different words for the gods of Egypt.
Yes. So it's imagine if imagine if you were in another cultural experience and someone went out of their way to bring you something that was very familiar to you but not familiar in that culture, like sweet tea. If you're sojourning in the wastelands of the distant north and you haven't had any good sweet tea in months, and somebody provides that, it might really sort of touch your heart and get your attention. I think that word on Pharaoh's mouth is pretty significant when he's talking about our God, Joseph's God. Yeah. Does that change the way we hear the purpose of the famine? I think potentially it does. Right? It could be that the whole point of this famine, I see two new possibilities. One is now we see more clearly that Joseph is in charge. Joseph is not just in charge, he's in big time charge. He's number 2 in the kingdom. So we can anticipate a little bit about what that's going to mean for a faithful child of God, a faithful Israelite, descendant of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, now we get Joseph, right? For him to be in a position of authority in Egypt. That's significant. But I think the other thing is, and maybe they're related, for even the Pharaoh of Egypt to acknowledge Israel's God, to acknowledge the power, the truth, the veracity, the authenticity of Elohim, of Israel's God. I think that's significant. Anything else that you notice in terms of how that purpose begins to become clearer to us? Let's read ahead, and then I hope we'll have time for a video, because it's always nice to break it up a little bit. Who would read for us that next bit, the shortest bit that we're going to read, from Genesis 45. Who might read that for us? Pretty please. Thank you, Richard. All right, before Richard reads, let me note that we've jumped from Genesis 41 to Genesis 45. And if you remember the wonderful story of the Technicolor Dreamcoat, there are several backs and forths between Joseph and his brothers who come to Egypt looking for bread, right? Jacob, their father, says, go to Egypt, see if you can buy some bread. I hear that they've got bread there. And Joseph hides his true identity. And this is the moment, several chapters later, where Joseph reveals himself to them. I've skipped that bit. Sorry for the loss of the drama. But what I want to hear are the words that Joseph uses to describe the famine. So now, Richard, thank you. Take it away.
Then Joseph said to his brothers, come closer to me. And they came closer. He said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve you as a remnant on earth and to keep you alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, and you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the ears of my brother Benjamin see that this is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell upon his brother's Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept with them. And after that, his brothers talked with him.
Thank you. Thank you. Do y'all remember this part of the story? Let's see if we can watch this video. If the sound works, I think we're going to watch it. This is
grade science, and if you're anything like me,
We have
you've
to watch
wasted your
the
brain
ads.
time trying to find a video for one of your lessons.
The Faithful Hall of Fame, Joseph. This is Joseph,
Hey!
who was the son of Israel and Rachel. But he had 11 brothers who hated him and sold him into slavery. After being put in jail, Joseph told of the future of Egypt when he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, and Joseph found favor with the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh made Joseph a leader in his kingdom. Just as Joseph had told the Pharaoh, Egypt had 7 years of abundance. Then the 7 years of abundance came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. But the Egyptians had food to eat because Joseph had planned for the famine. There was famine in all the other lands, and many came to Joseph to buy food. There was even a famine in the land that Joseph came from. So when Israel heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent his sons to buy some. But Israel did not send Benjamin with the others because he was afraid that harm might come to him. When Joseph's brothers came to him, Joseph recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger. So Joseph decided to test his brothers. He had his interpreter tell them to send for Benjamin, who had stayed home. And then he threw his brothers in jail for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph let all but one of the brothers take grain to their starving households with the instruction to bring Benjamin back. But Joseph provided for his brothers' journey and gave them grain and silver. The brothers did exactly as Joseph instructed, as they were scared that God was punishing them for what they had done to Joseph so many years before. They traveled home to their father's house, then back to Egypt. Now that he had seen that they brought Benjamin, Joseph was overwhelmed, so he released the brother who was still in prison. But Joseph decided to play one more trick on his brothers. He sent the brothers away but told his servant to hide his silver cup in Benjamin's bag. Then Joseph told the servant to go after the brothers and retrieve the cup. The brothers hadn't traveled far before the servant stopped them and accused them of stealing the cup. Joseph could no longer control himself before his attendants. He made them leave so he could be alone with his brothers, and he told his brothers who he really was. Ta-da! He told them of his life and all he had experienced, and he forgave them for what they had done. God was with Joseph and took care of him and showed him favor.
That video in part, not only because of it's a good summary of the Joseph story, which we didn't get a whole of, but also I'm interested in the relationship between that and what we read and what we didn't read. But before we dig into the video, let me just start. So what do you hear in Joseph's words to his brothers in the text? And how does that compare with what you heard of Joseph in the video? What do you notice? When Joseph explains why he says something, and then it seems like the video suggests something. I'm curious. What do you note? What do you note about Joseph's explanation when Joseph explains to them why this has all happened? What do you notice? What do you notice? Yeah, Ray, thank you.
That seems like fatherhood. I saw the contrast between God has made me a father to Pharaoh, now go to my father. So I get the takeaway from your first question here, Theological Claims, that fatherhood is a channel for God's will and blessing.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. What else? What else do you notice? What else did you notice? What words would you use to describe the Joseph of the video? Like, what characteristics would you use to describe him? Just call him out. What sort of person was that Joseph?
He was a trickster.
A trickster. That's the one word I thought of. What else would you say? Anything else you would say? Just from the video. What else would you say? Would you say vengeful? Yeah. Would you say compassionate? Powerful. I would say powerful. He had all the cards. He was in control of that moment. Yeah. I think the video leaves out a little bit of the manipulation that Joseph does in the story. We didn't read that part. But he has them convinced that Benjamin's going to be killed. And the relationship between their father's fear of losing their son Benjamin and Joseph's decision to threaten Benjamin's life with that silver cup gag, I think we kind of missed. This is probably a story intended for children, so maybe we get the whole sort of murderous plot and we leave that out for good reasons. But I think there's a little bit more emotional manipulation going on than we see in the story. Yeah. I also think that the way Joseph talks about the famine and his brother's decision is different from what we see in the video. And the video doesn't get us there quite as fully as the text does. Just notice what we read in verse 5. To his brothers, he says, don't be troubled, don't be distressed, don't be angry with yourselves because you sold me here. Joseph goes right to the heart. And I do think the video did a good job of that. When they were walking back, they were afraid because they thought God was punishing them for selling their brother into slavery, right? So I think that, so don't be distressed because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. That's a remarkable theological claim that Joseph is making. It's one that I couldn't make, that I wouldn't dare make, to say that my brothers sold me into slavery so that I could be arrested and imprisoned, set free because I interpreted some dreams, make my place in Pharaoh's house, become really powerful so that I could preserve life. That's a remarkable thread, and you really got to trace it the way Joseph does to figure it out. I think Joseph is making some profound theological claims, and even if we aren't willing to make them ourselves, I do think they're significant. The way that Joseph is willing to attribute God's hand in all of this. Does that give you pause? Does that trouble you? Do you find that strange? Do you find it comforting? What's your reaction to hearing the way Joseph is able to say, it wasn't you who sent me here, but God sent me here in order to make me a father of Pharaoh? Can you say, are you able to say that or see that in your own life from time to time? I wonder. Any reactions to that? Yeah? Ray, what you got? I'd love to hear from you. What you got?
Isn't that why people go to church, to try to make some sense out of the nasty things that happen to them and try to overcome them?
Good question. That's probably a reason that some people come to church. Yeah. Yeah, to make sense of the hardships and to find strength to overcome them. Yeah. What else would you say? How else do you respond to this theological work that Joseph is doing, that the text is doing, right? The text is suggesting that God caused the brothers to sell Joseph into slavery, that God caused the famine to happen, that God caused Joseph to interpret these dreams so that, why? So that God would preserve life. What gives somebody the ability faithfully to make those bold leaps, those bold interpretive leaps? Dylan, you got to have some chutzpah to say that plainly, or maybe you see something that others don't see. Dylan, what do you think?
I always think when talking about looking for a purpose in something, especially something difficult, looking for a purpose in famine or suffering, that it's a tricky place to be, especially when you're in the middle of it. It's easy to look back in retrospect and say, "Oh, God brought me out of this," but no one would choose the famine. No one would choose the suffering. And I see this famine, and I see Joseph's life as a point in his life where he came to see God has done something great, and it wouldn't have happened if I wouldn't have suffered. I wouldn't never have chosen this path. Yeah. I wouldn't have chosen to be sold into slavery, but I'm now at a point where I can see what that purpose was.
Yeah. Yeah, that rings a bell for me. Is there a difference in saying that God caused all of these things to happen so that this would be the outcome? Is there a difference between that and looking back and saying, oh, I can now see where God was present in all these things, how God has brought all these things together? I'm not sure there's all that much of a difference, but it sure feels different, doesn't it? It feels different to be able to be on the other side of that and say, oh, I can see that. And part of I think the ethic that we have embodied is that I can say that in my life, but I'm not sure I would say that for your life. Like, I might say this hardship has happened so that I could come to this place, but I would never say this hardship happened so that you could come to this place, right? Yeah, response?
Yeah, I would agree that there is a subtle difference in that perspective, because one perspective is a perspective where you can blame God. When you're looking for purpose, there's this like, why did you let this happen, God? And sometimes there's not satisfactory answers. Yeah. But the other perspective is saying, hey, this happened, but God walked with me through it.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. And I don't think my identifying God's presence through that path excludes other people's insights into why. Like, we don't have to have the same why, right? But for it to be an authentic why for me. All right, let's read the last bit, because I don't want to miss it, because this is where This is where famine really rears its ugly head. Who would read for us the last section, which starts at the bottom of that page and continues over a paragraph on the next? Who would read that last bit for us? Dylan, since you're by the microphone, would you read that for us, please? Thanks.
Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. When the money from the land of Egypt and from the land of Canaan was spent, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give me your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. That year he supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock. When that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said, "We cannot hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of our cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Shall we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We with our land will become slaves to Pharaoh. Just give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold their fields because of the famine was very severe upon them, and the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made slaves of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Now that I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you, sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones." They said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my lord, we will be slaves to Pharaoh." So Joseph made a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the 5th. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's.
This is the part of the story we don't remember, right? The forced slavery and the seizure of land in a time of great loss. I mean, imagine what it means to belong to a country, a nation, a kingdom, in which the king has all the resources and you've got none. And they'll say, "Sure, I'll take all your land and all your lives and your livelihood and your freedoms, and I'll let you continue living, but for in perpetuity, you owe me," right? That's the part of the story we don't remember. But when you hear about slavery in Egypt, that becomes a part of our story, right? We remember that the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, but I don't think we remembered that Joseph was in some ways responsible for not only enslaving the Israelites, Abraham's children who were there, Joseph and his brothers and their families, but also the whole nation. What's going on here? What's happening? What do you notice? What in the world? I went to a service at Passover several years ago and heard a rabbi preach on this text. This is an interesting text to hear in anticipation of the Exodus story, right? But we kind of forget this bit. It was a powerful sermon. Yeah, what do you notice? What do you notice in this text? What do you want to shake from this text? What do you want to ask of this text? If you could ask the text a question, what might you ask the text? Yeah, Ray.
Does this mean that I'll own nothing and be happy?
Does this mean I'll own nothing and be happy? Yeah. What else? Yeah, what else? Yeah. Here goes the microphone. Yeah, thank you.
To me, it seems revisionist. It seems, if we relate it today and the stories of American slavery, many of the textbooks in the South contain similar stories. And then they were all happy and thanked their masters, and we all lived happily ever after. It seems like that kind of revision of, and we're so happy to be just slaves of the Pharaoh, and we were so lucky.
Yes, yeah, revisionist history. It's like holding a referendum in an occupied territory about whether you want to be annexed, right? As one person was interviewed, said, "They came with guns. What am I supposed to do? Say no?" Right? Yeah, right? This happens. It's not just 19th century or ancient, right? Yeah. What else do you notice in the text? What happens when the resources of the land become concentrated in the storehouses of the few? Like of the government, the Pharaoh, the king, the dictator, in this case, the corporations or others. I mean, I think something happens. Something happens when not only the grain, but also the capacity to grow grain, right? Something has to change when no one has any money to survive. And the result is I'm going to take even what you don't have, right? I'm going to take your future produce. Like, okay, you're going to mortgage your life in perpetuity. What happened? What does that say about famine? What does that say about God? I think it would be easy to read this story of Joseph and think, on the lips of Joseph, God has been involved in all of this to preserve a faithful remnant, to save lives. Without Joseph, who knows how many people would have died in the famine? Thanks for Joseph. But then we get to this and we realize, where do we draw the line? Where do we draw the line between saving lives and monetizing lives? And I think in times of disruption, especially drought, war, food supply disruption, inflation, pandemic, other influences that means that the availability of food isn't the same as it is, it's easy in those moments for certain organizations, corporations, individuals to become richer while other people are struggling to make ends meet. This is not foreign to us. This is happening all around us. The call for us then is, what are we going to do about it, right? What are we going to do about that? The questions I want you to reflect on as we wrap up today, and I'll read them and then I'll stop and give you some chance to respond to them or to ask your own questions. Like, as we read this part of the story, who actually is hurt by the famine and who benefits from it? What's going on in this story? What do we learn more generally about food insecurity from the story? Again, we asked this last week, and I'll ask it again. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that people have enough to eat? Is it their own responsibility? Is it the government's responsibility? Is it the church's responsibility, the neighbor's responsibility? Whose responsibility is it? Does anybody remember what Leviticus says about selling your family inheritance? I'll go ahead and tell you that the Torah says that you can sell your land, you can mortgage your land, but when the year of Jubilee comes back, it goes back to the families of the original owners. Because to lose your land is to lose your chance for survival in the future. And this story, the Egyptian story, seems to be the exact opposite of that. Lastly, what happens when ownership of land is transferred to corporations or governments? What happens when all of us become sharecroppers, if you will? Thoughts about that or anything that we've talked about today? What do you hear? What do you notice? Responses to those questions or just to the theme or the topic itself? What would you say? What do you got? Yeah, Ray.
Well, if you look at the ecosystem of Egypt, all the arable land is along a river, and it's easy to control and easy to put under one person's management. In our country, at least the eastern half of our country, is well watered, and I think it's our responsibility to some extent to protect our own food security by growing our own food.
Yeah. Victory gardens for a new era, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Dylan.
No, one of the things I take away from this is a new insight due to this last reading where Joseph does some questionable behavior with slavery and such. For me, it's a reminder that humans are still human, even when they're chosen by God. And even heroes aren't perfect. And we tend to idolize, especially biblical heroes, but even modern-day heroes, and even people with the best of intents and that have been used by God. They're still human, and they still can do some very questionable things at best.
Absolutely. And I love that despite being a revisionist take on the story, at least we still preserve that. Like, isn't it interesting that we still tell the story of David and the rape of Bathsheba? Isn't it interesting that we still tell the story of Joseph and the enslavement of Egypt? We don't have to remember those stories, but we remember them, I think, as you point out, because we need to remember that even divinely appointed or anointed, perhaps, leaders are in most cases human, with one exception. Yeah. And then even then fully human too, but that's a whole other theological point. Yes?
I feel like we can also work at the story from another angle. It kind of cautions us against the concentration of power in general. Because you notice that Joseph in this story, offered, come here, I will bring you to this land, you will be plenty, your children will be fine, all this stuff. And then he said, okay, give me all your money, give me all your animals, give me all your land and make you slaves. As the power got concentrated into the hands of the Pharaoh, now the people themselves lose their choice of self-destiny. And now they have to fight and rebel back to get it in the future when you go to the further stories in the Bible, where Moses and them come into play. Moses is basically undoing what Joseph has done by concentrating all the power. And you can kind of look at that sometimes in place here in the national stage, where you see as power gets concentrated, for example, in Russia. And you kind of see what happens when you have all that power gets concentrated.
Yeah, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, as we know. Yeah, absolutely. And again, even Joseph, the hero, becomes the vehicle through which what is good. It is good that the grain is preserved. It is good that there's enough to eat. Without that, how many millions of people would have died? And yet, how human it is that we can use that to become a way to enslave others. Yeah. So what I want us to kind of leave with is just to remember and realize that famine is not just an accident, and that famine is an opportunity for us to reflect on and to recognize what's going on behind the scenes, what's going on here. I don't believe that God reached down and said, let's cause a famine so that Joseph, who's been sold into slavery, I don't believe that it all works out like that. But I do believe that with God's guidance and the guidance of the faithful community, we are able to look back and recognize how to put things together and to see even causal relationships from the backside, if you will. I think it's important for us to have our eyes, our ears, and our theologically attuned hearts and spirits available to make sense of what's going on around us. We might not be so bold as to say, I can see exactly why God is doing this. I know exactly what's going to happen. But if we aren't adding some theological reflection and language to the events that are happening around us, then we end up with a consolidation of resources in the hands of a very few, and then without even realizing it, the Lazaruses around us are sitting by the gate covered in sores. So it's a timely lesson for our sermon today. If you haven't heard the sermon, it's an excellent sermon that Adeline is preaching. Well, I'm glad y'all are here. Thank you. We've got one more week in this series, The Prodigal Son, and I don't think I mentioned it earlier. The reason, it's not an accident, the reason we're doing this is because the week after that, Neria Love Parrish will be with us as a Tippy speaker, and she'll be talking about farming, about food insecurity, about climate change, and how all of that is a part of what it means for us to be faithful and to be disciples of Jesus. So I'm glad y'all are here, and I hope to see you next week. Thank y'all.